It is a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Bridget WALLER. Professor Bridget WALLER works at the Trent Nottingham University. I would rather let you the floor and thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. I'm very happy you're here, and I'm looking forward to hear you and to discuss your feelings. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. I think this initiative is fantastic, and I'm really pleased to be part of it. So thank you. So as Marco said, I'm going to mainly talk about my current ERC grant in individual differences in facial expressivity, as I'm holding one of these ERC consolidator grants, and that takes up most of my time at the moment. But before I go into the details of that, I want to give everyone a bit of background about my previous work to sort of show you how I arrived at this project and how I arrived at this idea, which I think hopefully will help sort of set the scene and help people understand where I'm coming from. So my background is in biology and psychology, and I really sit on the interface at the moment. So I work in the psychology department, but lots of my ideas and methods are informed by biological theory. So I think I ask psychological questions, but I address them through an understanding of evolution and through an understanding of biological systems. And the question that I tend to focus on most, and that's in the past and also still now in my current grant, is what are facial expressions for? What do they do in social interaction? What are the advantages that individuals get when they express them or when they understand them in others? And so I think about facial expressions as part of a biological system of social interaction, and I want to try and understand how they work and why they've evolved, essentially. And I think that this is actually not a question that is asked very often, and when it is asked, I don't think it's asked very well, and I certainly don't think that we have all the answers to this question yet. And I think the reason that we find this question so problematic is actually the fault of Charles Darwin. And it's not a very popular thing to do, to start bashing Darwin, particularly in biology. But actually, I think we really need to do that, and we need to go back and think about how our current understanding of facial expression has been influenced by Charles Darwin, and we need to question some of those assumptions. So Darwin wrote his very famous book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, and here he really set the scene for making comparisons between humans and other animals in terms of behavior and what he would have termed emotional behavior. And he was very comfortable using emotional terms to describe behaviors in humans and in other animals. So here we have a picture of a man that he described as expressing scorn, a dog that he described as being humble, a cat that he described as being terrified. And he was extremely comfortable using these terms. And through using these terms for both humans and other animals, he felt that's how we could really understand the continuity between species and how evolution had arrived at all the variety that we see across species. And the fact that he used these terms was really related to his fundamental philosophy underpinning these comparisons. And he thought that mind, feeling and thought was automatically expressed through behavior. So he thought that how an animal was feeling is automatically out there in the world, is embodied within the social interaction. And he gave much less thought into the function of displaying these behaviours. So that was automatic. He didn't think that we needed to understand why feeling or mind or thought might be expressed in behaviour. He thought that relationship between the two was automatic. And there may be reasons why some of you subscribe to that view, but what I want to try and explain is why I think that makes my world particularly problematic. So what we're left with as a result of this assumption that there is this correspondence between behaviour and internal state is that facial expressions are commonly and casually associated with emotion. Even the term we use, expression, implies that something is expressed to the outside world. So if we look at these displays, if we look at these behaviours that are universally recognised, so all populations produce these, to a greater or lesser extent, produce these facial expressions regardless of language and culture. The terms that scientists and to an extent in lay well, in language, the terms that we use to describe these are emotional. So we think about what the sender or the person producing those facial movements, we think about what they are feeling at the time, whether they're feeling surprised or sad or happy, etc. So we commonly, in the scientific world and beyond, use emotional terms to describe these facial displays. Even the term expression is loaded with meaning, I think. Why do I think this is a problem? I think it's a problem in a very simple way because we could be wrong if we're attributing emotion, particularly when we're looking at other animals or any non-linguistic entity, in fact. And I also think, and this is a more important point really, if we don't consider and understand how facial expressions are used in social interaction, then I'm not really sure that we ever understand what they mean. I think that if we stop purely at what the individual is feeling when they're presenting them and when they're producing these facial expressions, I don't think we're ever going to really understand what they're doing, what they're for, which is my first question that I'm trying to focus on. And I'm not saying that emotion is unimportant, and that's an easy mistake to make. Like I'm not, it's very easy to listen to me and then think that I don't believe emotions exist, which is not true. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that emotions do exist. Emotions are part of the whole facial expression system, but I don't think that they are the only thing that we need to think about. And I certainly don't think that's the end of the conversation. So I think of a facial appearance change. So we have this middle image here, this is a crested macaque producing a facial appearance change. And I think that that is going to result in some sort of meaning or that's going to result in some sort of behavioral change in other animals, some sort of social interaction outcome. And that is going to be part of the meaning. So what happens? What's the social outcome? And what is causing that facial appearance change? We're going to have facial muscle actions, of course. There's going to be physiological changes in terms of the body and the brain of that individual. And yes, there probably is some sort of subjective emotion or motivation or intention that goes along with that, that it's the experience of the animal producing it. But again, I think that's just one part of it. I think it's a mistake to simply stop at that part in terms of emotion at that point. I also think that a focus on emotion is deeply unhelpful when we're making comparisons between species, which up until this point has been a really strong focus of mine. So if we think about the human smile, for example, we can see physical similarities in many different mammalian species, possibly even beyond. So we can see these expressions in primates are called bare teeth displays, and they share some morphological components associated with the human smile. And many scientists have suggested that these have the same ancestral root, so that these are essentially the same display, the human smile and these bare teeth display. And others have argued you could even go beyond primates and look at other mammals and different expressions that they produce that are probably associated with the smile in some way. So it's useful making these comparisons, but I don't think thinking of these things as having the same emotion is helpful at all. I'm not sure that helps us understand the evolutionary relationships or function in any of these different species. And in fact, we can illustrate that quite nicely if we look at how the human smile and the chimpanzee bare teeth, which is in the middle here, and the rhesus macaque bare teeth, if we consider how they differ. So in terms of the social context, you could use the term meaning here, in which they are produced, then we see a broad spectrum in which these different expressions sit. So human smiles are used in relatively affiliative contexts, although not all the time. And in fact, I think you could discuss that a lot in terms of how the human smile might actually not be affiliative in some contexts. And then you can go right through to the other end of the spectrum of submission, where the rhesus macaque bare teeth expression is used, and they only use it in submissive context. They only use it when they are communicating with more dominant individuals, so it's part of a very linear dominance hierarchy. And so these are really different contexts. An affiliative greeting context with a friend is arguably very different to a submissive context with a more senior ranking animal. And this seems to relate very closely to the species social structure, whether they have a more egalitarian social structure or a more despotic social structure. And through that, we think we can understand the social pressures or the selective pressures that have acted on these expressions and caused them to divert and change through evolutionary time. And none of that has got anything to do with emotion. And I think they probably, if they have something to do with emotion, which they probably do, then that's arguably going to be different for every single species. So it's not useful to think of the smile as being associated with happiness, which is often what we do when we're trying to make these comparisons. And in fact, I would go as far as to say thinking about the smile in terms of happiness is also not particularly helpful, because we know that it has really diverse usage in humans as well. So what this is, so the way that people have sort of tried to get around this in human psychology research to try and not use these subjective terms is through the human facial action coding system, which many of you are probably familiar with. And Paul Ekman and colleagues developed this in the late 70s. I think it's an important point to note here that Paul Ekman does have some very strict ideas and views on emotion and how that's associated with facial expression, but that's got nothing to do with facts. Facts is purely an observational tool, and I certainly don't subscribe to many of the assumptions that Paul Ekman and colleagues make. But what facts does is it simply identifies the minimal units of facial movement, which we call action units or AUs. Each AU is based on a specific muscle movement or combination of muscle movements. And the idea is this is a standardized, objective way of recording facial expressions and facial movements, which doesn't require you to use any emotional terms. So if you're looking at these different facial configurations, these different behaviors that this child is producing, then you could use some very loaded subjective terms. So this is my son, and I think in the middle photo he was probably experiencing some sort of injustice, and I could also come up with ideas on how I think he might have been feeling in some of these other pictures. But that's my view, and I could be wrong, and we can't ask him because at this point he was too small to express any of those ideas verbally. What we can do instead, though, is use facts, where we can simply record which facial muscle movements are produced in each one of these pictures, which is simply handy. It's a handy scientific tool. That's all it is. It doesn't require you to have any particular philosophical stance. So facial movement can be recorded in minute detail, which also reduces any perceptual bias we might have. It's quite hard to look at faces because we have these very specialized brains when we look at faces. So if we want to look at them scientifically, we also need to remove ourselves from that situation slightly. So it can reduce our perceptual bias, and we don't need to attribute emotion, which I think is extremely useful. So Facts was developed in the late 70s, and then we came along, various different people in various different teams, to modify Facts for use with different species. The first one was chimp Facts, which we developed with Kim Bard, Sarah Jane Vick, Lisa Parr, and others, and we modified it for use with chimpanzees. And then we went through various other primate species, and more recently we've developed it for domestic species such as horses and cats and dogs. And the reason, just as an aside, the reason that we think these domestic animals are quite interesting, aside from the fact that there's an applied interest, so lots of practitioners think they might be able to use these systems to assess pain or, you know, for some sort of welfare, clinical applications, but we're also interested in them because it gives us a window into how facial expressions might have changed over a period of domestication. So how have humans imposed their needs on the faces of dogs and cats and horses in order to look in a way that we want or that we respond to? And that gives us an interesting case study, I think. So with my colleagues, Juliana Kaminski, we've been focused on this in dogs for the last few years quite a lot. So we've developed all these different fact systems, and we make them freely available on this website called Animal Facts. And people can download the manuals, they can learn these systems, and they can apply to take a certification test. And we provide all that freely. And at the moment, we've got some problems with the videos, if any of you are interested in doing this, so I apologize for that. But on the whole, I think this is quite a useful thing to be available for scientists. The way that we arrive at some of these systems is through doing dissections. So we work closely with anatomists who do these dissections so we can compare between species. And in some of the early species, with some of the early development, we did intramuscular electrical stimulation, which helped us to see how these muscles were moving. So this gives us these things which we call muscle movement maps, where basically we can see where all the different muscles move on the face, and we can record them using different numbers to notate them. And I think when you look at this as a take-home message across these different species, to me, they all look quite similar, which is interesting because some of these animals are not particularly closely related. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that there's only so many places that the face can go. So you can open orifices and you can move things around. And so it's always going to be fairly similar, I think, how any species does that. But it also shows us there's quite a lot of phylogenetic conservation. So these species haven't really changed. So what humans are using for their facial communication is actually some architecture that's been around for a very long time. I think we've elaborated it to an extent, but I think fundamentally these are really quite archaic systems. And I think that's an interesting thing to remember when we're trying to understand what the face is doing in social interactions and in our culture. So this sort of leads me on to the ERC Consolidated grant. And I think all these different things or this background led me to a very interdisciplinary perspective where I'm combining an understanding of psychology with an understanding of anatomy and also cross-species differences. And that all these elements are involved in my ERC Consolidated grant, which makes it, I think, novel and interesting, but it also makes it quite hard because we have different groups of people who aren't necessarily used to talking to each other, and they're forced to and to understand each other's data, which they're not always used to doing. So what I started thinking about when I was developing my ERC Consolidated grant idea is that there is individual variation that we haven't really grappled with and we haven't really understood. We know that people are not all the same. We know that people exhibit individual differences in many different ways. And we know that this variation is important. We know it impacts on individual lives. So simple things like height can have an impact on your life. Simple things like intelligence have an impact on your life. So why on earth would we ignore any of this variation? It seems important to try and understand it. We also know, and I'll go on to the data about this in a minute, we also know that people have different facial expressions. And the facial expressions that people produce are the result of different things. In part, it's to do with anatomy. In part, it's to do with psychology and how people might be motivated to do different things. And it could also be to do with behavior. So all these different things need to be understood if we really want to unpack the variation that we see in facial expressions. But I think that this variation, even though it's been understood in different pockets of science, on the whole, this variation has been ignored, which is really interesting, I think, in itself. So my project, FaceDiff, which is what I call it, will investigate individual differences in facial expression, and that's what we're doing at the moment. What do we know already? We know that facial muscles vary from person to person. So any one of us will have different facial muscles in our faces. They might be asymmetric. Some of them might be missing entirely. They might differ in size and structure. And this is something that has been well known to the anatomists for quite some time. So if you speak to anybody who regularly dissects bodies, they will tell you, yes, of course, the facial muscles are highly variable. But it's not something that has filtered into the psychologists and mainstream understanding of how facial expressions are used. We also know that individuals do vary in the expressions that they produce and how expressive they are on the whole. So there's a few isolated pockets, a few papers on this. And we also know that these differences are stable over time. So this seems to be a stable trait that people exhibit. So the sorts of variation that they show when they're young, that carries with them over time. And we also know that these individual differences can be strong enough that some people have tried to use these as biometrics for identity recognition. So obviously face recognition is a really important thing. Lots of different people are interested in that for various reasons, applied and fundamental. And we think that the extent to which people move their facial muscles differently could actually feed into this to quite some extent. So individual differences are recognised, but I think they tend to be more in applied fields. And I don't think that this reality has been integrated into theories of emotion to a great extent. Why is that? I think it's because we've had this, and this relates back to some of the points I was making at the beginning. It relates to this dominant historical focus on universality that has utterly dominated the facial expression field for decades. And I think that one of the most fundamental assumptions we have about facial expressions is they always mean the same thing, and those things are emotion. And this picture, which is a really commonly seen figure that you'll see in any papers, shows you the facial expression of disgust, the facial expression of fear, etc. So we think they always mean the same thing. And in order to mean the same thing, they have to appear the same across individuals. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a common language. They wouldn't be understood. So disgust always has to look the same on all different individuals. And in order to look the same across individuals, everyone has to have the same muscles. So these assumptions are feeding into each other. And this idea that people have different facial muscles simply isn't hammering home, because no one wants to hear that. It doesn't fit with the theory that we have that is fundamental to our understanding of emotion. So I think that these things lead to this almost exclusive focus on the similarity between individuals rather than the differences. I think the differences are often buried, or they're just seen as noise, and almost an exclusive focus on emotion rather than social function, which I think I've tried to outline before, I think is problematic. But we know this is more, we know that this connection between faces and emotion is more complex and variable. There are various different groups that have been working on this idea for some time, but there's been a recent paper that has received a lot of attention by Lisa Feldman Barrett and others, where they did a meta-analysis of lots of different papers where people have tried to examine the felt emotion, the produced facial muscle movement, so the produced facial expression, and then how others perceive that and what they think it means. And what we know is that that connection, what this meta-analysis shows us, is that connection exists, but it's loose, it's tentative, it varies depending on all sorts of different factors. So that is not something that is there where there is a direct correlation between these three things. So it's complex, it's variable. We need to rethink how we understand those different elements of felt emotion, facial expression, and reception by others, and how observers see those things. So the plan for the ERC Consolidated grant was to try and build a hypothesis that might help us understand this variation and why it exists. And the central hypothesis is a very simple one, which is that facial expression aids the formation and maintenance of social networks. I think this is significant and important because we know that having a larger social network as an individual, so having lots of individuals that you associate with, is associated with better health, better well-being, and greater longevity. So there is an applied reason why this is interesting and important. The central hypothesis is underpinned by relatively mainstream evolutionary theory. It's controversial in some circles, but most people tend to agree that there is some association between this, and that is the social brain hypothesis, the idea that social cognition and communication has evolved as social glue to allow us to live in large social groups. And yes, there are variations of this theory that people argue about, but ultimately people, I think, agree that there has been social pressure, that the pressure to live in large social groups has exerted pressure on communication as humans have evolved. From this hypothesis, we can derive some very simple predictions. One is that expressive people should have more friends. And I have that little asterisk there because we have some data in review at the moment suggesting that individuals, older adults who have certain personality traits, live in larger social groups. So it does seem that these socio-communicative traits are associated with having more friends, essentially. But that's a very simple linear relationship that I wouldn't expect us to see on a grand scale. And I think the expressivity should be modulated by other traits. So if we have a central idea of how expressive an individual would be, that is going to be modulated, or that's going to interact with how well individuals read the faces of others. Like, so whether you produce your facial expression in the right way, and that's essentially going to be how you're reading others and you're reading the context, but also how well you control your face. And again, these are things that we know vary from individual to individual. We all know those people that do not have a poker face, that cannot control what they're doing with their face, regardless of whether the moment demands it. So trying to see how these three different variables interact, I think, is going to be important. And what we're probably going to, we're not quite there yet, but I think what we're probably going to see is some sort of niche picking structure where people live in different niches, different social niches, depending on which of these traits they're good at and how they interact with each other. So we can discuss that more later, I think. So in terms of how the project is now split in work packages, the first work package is focused on individual differences in facial expression and how that relates to individual differences in social networks. So there's a sort of human behavior package. And then there's an anatomy package, work package 2, where we will be doing dissections to examine individual differences in facial anatomy. And then work package 3 is a cross-species comparison. We're focusing here on rhesus macaques. The reason we're focusing on rhesus macaques is not necessarily because they're the best comparison. They are a comparison, but not necessarily the best one. But we know lots about these animals. So rhesus macaques are the main biomedical model. They're the main lab primate. And so we know a lot about their brains, know a lot about their behavior. And so that it's helpful that we can build on that body of data that we already have. The other reason that having a cross-species comparison at all is very useful is here we can join up all the dots. So with humans, we're not going to see how somebody's facial muscles work, how they behave, and then what their social network is like. But we can see that with the macaques, because during the course of our project, some of the animals will die, not because we are causing them to, but they will die through the course of the project, which means we can dissect their faces so we can join up those dots and see exactly how the facial muscles relate to the movements that one of those individuals produces when they're alive, because we'll have video footage of those animals, and we can see how that relates to their social networks. And with the rhesus macaques, these will be enclosed social networks. So we have animals in captivity and in the wild, and we can count all the individuals in a group and see exactly where our animals sit within it. So we have an understanding of the quality of their social relationships as well as the quantity, which is very useful, and it gets us to see things from a slightly different angle than we do in the human population alone. And then work package 4 is an integration of the data. And this is going to be the hardest bit, where we try and look at the facial anatomy data and in relation to the human behavior data and the primate behavior data, and we try and make it all make sense. At the moment, I'm hoping that's going to all look nice and clean, but of course it won't. So we're going to have to think about that when it comes to it. So the project is split into these different work packages. The first one on facial expression and social networks will basically encompass psychological and behavioral experiments in the lab and online. That will mainly be with the humans, mainly will be here at NTU in Nottingham, but I'm going to show you a little bit of data that we've got from some of the online work that we've been doing during COVID, where we haven't been able to get into the lab. And then our second work package on facial anatomy will be facial dissections at the University of Liverpool. So my grant is split across different sites. We'll also be doing some microanatomy, so we can delve deeper into the muscles and see the exact profile of muscle fibers, which tells you a bit about how much control an individual has over those muscle fibers, which is also, I think, going to be very useful. And we're also going to, I've got this spinny brain here because we're also going to look at these existing facial MRI scans. There are many databases of brain scans that we can tap into, and some of these have information about soft tissue at the front of the face that we can use, so we can get an understanding of volumetric information about some of those muscles. And then the third work package on non-human primates, we're trying to do automated facial tracking. We will be using MacFax. We'll also be doing cognitive testing to see how they perceive faces, not only how they produce facial expressions, and we'll be doing dissections for animals that die during the course of the project. Some of this will take place at the Medical Research Centre in the UK, which is our captive groups living in large social groups, but we will also be working at hopefully at the Caribbean Primate Research Centre, where we will be looking at semi-free ranging groups that are much bigger. So there's pros and cons, but the idea is that we should have a wild and captive replicants, which should be useful if our central idea is correct or not. This is my team. So I sort of loosely have these different work package teams: the human behavior team, the primate behavior team, and the anatomy team. But obviously, as you go on, other people become involved, which is important and useful, but it does make things a little unwieldy at times. But I have other supervisors who are going to support some of the PhD students, so I'm bringing them into the team, which I think is important to remember, that not everybody involved in these ERC projects is necessarily funded by them, but they are involved. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the early findings from work package 1. our initial idea, our pre-COVID plan, was to do laboratory-based experiments and to stage dyadic social interactions. So we wanted to get two people in the lab at the same time, get them to interact with each other, record their facial movement, record some physiological data, and then examine how that might relate to their social network. So it's quite a simple idea. But obviously COVID happened, so we have this contingency plan. So like everybody else, we moved things online to see if we could make things work. So here we decided to stage dyadic social interactions. I'll explain how we did that in a minute. Record facial movement in the same way and do this via Zoom. And then our post-COVID plan is to go back to the lab and confirm some of the findings that we've found and do some follow-up experiments too. So the question, of course, that we were plagued with at the beginning was, well, how do you capture real life social interaction online? We wanted to get people interacting face-to-face in a lab. Now we can't do that. And I think we worried about this a lot to begin with. And then, of course, we reminded ourselves, and I think we learned through COVID that online interaction is real life social interaction. You know, we're doing it now. Like, this is real. Like, it's silly and meaningless to pretend this is some sort of artifact. This is us interacting. And I think actually we can make this work for us in possibly even in a better way than we did in the lab. So we did a 30-minute Zoom call. We had 52 participants. This was a sort of pilot that we wanted to do at the beginning. And what we did to set this up, to try and make this work and emulate the real online social interaction that people would do, is our experimenter, so my postdoc Ethna Kavanagh, posed as a participant. And then we sent instructions to both of the participants through the chat, pretending that was another experimenter, a virtual experimenter, but in fact that was Ethna. So she was pretending to be a participant, but she was feeding them information that was supposedly coming from some other experimenter elsewhere. And we designed, through this 30-minute Zoom call, multiple conditions to stimulate the behavioral responses that we were interested in. So we wanted to see how they would move their face in response to certain events and within the social interaction that they were having with Ethna, our experimenter. So I'm going to show you some of these examples. So on the left here is Ethna Kavanagh, who is the postdoc working on this. And then on the right is one of our participants. So we had some very simple conditions and some more complex conditions. This is one of the simpler ones, which of course is simply a greeting. So I'm just hoping this is going to work.
Hi, how are you doing? Yeah, not too bad.
So for my purposes, this is an extremely rich interaction. Like, it seems really boring. This is what we do with everybody, but there's loads going on. There's loads of wiggling around and there's lots of facial movement. And this is interesting. Like, already with these people don't know each other, and I've got data. There is facial movement that is exploding on the screen from my purposes. So we have this greeting condition. And then we had a politeness condition where we wanted to see how the participant responds to a bad joke. So Ethna starts
How do
this.
you make a piece of paper dance?
I don't know.
You put a little dance in it.
Oh, that was funny.
So, you know, it's not a particularly good joke. We wanted to see how they would respond. And then we had a conflict condition where we told the participants that they had a reward, that they had to decide how to split it. And Ethna starts off this conversation by suggesting an unfair reward split.
Let's discuss. How about I get 80% and you get 20%?
How so?
I'd like to get as much of the reward as possible, I think.
Seriously?
And then
Let's discuss.
And then one of our final conditions, we asked them to keep a straight face and not move their face. We wanted to get an understanding of how they could control. And we used this to tell them something we had to tell them to debrief in terms of the purpose of the experiment.
Now, I have something to tell you while you try to keep your face straight. I am not a participant in this study. I've been posing as a participant, but I'm in fact a researcher in this study.
So basically that was our, so we had this sort of 30-minute call. There's other conditions as well, and we use exactly the same. So Ethna was amazing. I'm bemused at how she did this so well, but she tried to keep her behavior as constant as possible in all the different conditions for all the different participants. And And we then, what we also did, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we'd also provided them with a questionnaire where we're trying to develop a self-report questionnaire to see if some of the questions that we ask people are predictive of how they do actually move their face. So we're trying to develop a scale that we could use for research purposes, that it does in some way represent how people express and how expressive they are. We also coded their facial movements. So we used the videos, of course, that we get from this Zoom call, and we coded it with Facts using iMotion's coding software. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, but Facts is very time consuming and onerous, and it can be very annoying to code. So we've bought this software which allows you to code Facts automatically. So you can just pop in your videos and it tracks the facial movements on the face. It's not perfect. Like there are inconsistencies with it, but then my argument to that is there's also inconsistencies when you have human coders. So I think you have to, I'm going to take the speed of coding over any argument of that in any way, I think. So I'm happy with it. So it means that we can pull this information together, and this is an extremely rich data set that we're still analysing, and which is great because it's given us lots of material to work with before we get back into the lab. So what I can just show you a couple of preview findings. We haven't analysed this. Well, we're going to submit this relatively soon, but we don't have, I can't show all the data for it at the moment. But one of the things that we did was Ethna, during her interaction with these participants, she recorded how much she liked them. Now, of course, she can't be objective because she knows the prediction of the hypothesis, but she is a participant in that. Like, she is interacting with these people for 30 minutes. So we think that her impression of whether she likes these people is meaningful and interesting. And so we wanted to record that, and we wanted to use that in some way. We're also getting these videos, or a section of these videos, rated for likability by independent raters. So we're going to get some information about that as well. But our first little poke around in the data is quite interesting. So how expressive they are in terms of the total movement they produce is positively correlated strongly with a correlation of 0.38 to Ethna's liking score. So she likes individuals who are more expressive, so individuals who are moving their face more, which is a hint that maybe we're right in our central hypothesis. But as I said, we're going to follow this up with scores from independent raters, and if they both match up, I think that will be really interesting. What this also fits quite well with is some other data that we have at the moment that is in review in Evolution of Human Behaviour, where we're looking at displacement behaviours, so scratching behaviours and self-touching behaviours. And we found that this displacement behaviour that people produce is also associated with likability, and this is independent raters. So people that are more expressive in terms of how they move their bodies are also more liked, more likable. And the displacement behaviour that people are producing is correlated with their average stress rating, so their self-perceived stress rating. So it's possibly an honest signal of their stress. And their self-reported stress is also correlated with how stressed other people think they are. So there seems to be a sort of, it's obviously not a perfect system, but people that are expressing their stress, if that's what this scratching means to others, more, that seem to be liked more, which sort of matches the data that we're seeing in terms of facial expressivity. So we think that's interesting, and I think it sort of it feeds into this idea. Oh, we also saw exactly the same pattern with Facts data. So the more facial movements they produce is also predictive of average likability. So it seems to be the same pattern. Like, the more behavior individuals are producing, the more likable they are, which I think is looping back to our hypothesis. We seem to be seeing the same thing. So I think that's it. I'm done for now. One thing I wanted to, so thank you very much for listening. Thank you to my team and everybody. But I also wanted to highlight that we are advertising for a research assistant at the moment, and we have funded PhDs available. If people are interested, or if you wanted to share with your contacts, then that would be really useful if you have anyone who is interested. So thank you very much.